Hey guys, Ron here. Hope everybody's well. Well, tonight I'm going to tell you the story of the rock group, pop group. They can't even be classified, but they were just known as the band. Somebody's going by me already. Usually it takes more than 30 seconds. That time it only took 30 seconds. 20 seconds. Anyway, the group known as the band. Before they became their own group, they were Bob Dylan's band, and I'll tell you about that. And before that, they were Levon and the Hawks. And before they were members of Ronnie Hawkins' group, the Hawks. So let's talk about the band, and let's talk about what happened to them. Their commercial success wasn't all that great, but they're still a legendary band. They had their second album was incredible. It was their best album, and had The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down and Up on Cripple Creek, probably two of their most famous songs. Their first album had a song called The Weight, W-E-I-G-H-T. But other than that, they were not a top 10 hippie band, or they couldn't even be classified. But anyway, I'm going to talk about them, talk about what happened to them, and talk about the two surviving members. So, see you in a second. We're going to keep walking here. Check this out. Pool at night. A pool and jacuzzi right on the boats, on the harbor. Pretty nice, huh? Very nice. So let's talk about the band. The band were 5 guys. 4 were Canadians and 1 was American. And the way they got together was, and I won't give you every detail because we'd be here for an hour. And here we go. Let him have his cigarette. Levon Helm was from Arkansas. Great drummer, great singer, multi-instrumentalist like all the guys in the band. Oh, he's happy. And Levon was playing with a guy named Ronnie Hawkins. And Ronnie Hawkins was quite the character. Ronnie Hawkins was the singer in the band, and Levon was his drummer, and of course our other bandmates. And they were both from Arkansas, and Ronnie Hawkins, like I say, quite the character, fancies himself kind of like the Elvis of Arkansas. Absolute crazed party animal, total womanizer, and just purported to have a great time all the time. And Levon was his drummer, and so Levon was in a wild environment from the beginning. Well, eventually Levon and Ronnie and the Hawks, Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks, the group, traveled north. They were gigging through Canada, and I don't remember the exact details, but somehow they met up with these other guys. And the final lineup became Rick Danko, who was a fantastic bass player and a very unique singing style. Rick also played fiddle. Richard Manuel. Richard was primarily the piano player, the keyboard player of 2 in the band. But Richard also played drums, kind of a slapstick, slappy style of drums that people would be able to sometimes tell the difference between he and Levon and sometimes not. And also Garth Hudson. And Garth was older than the other guys. In fact, Garth had been teaching music, and I think it was, I don't remember who, must have been Ronnie, that had to convince Garth's parents that he'd be helping out the guys by training them musically while he was also in the band. So you've got the Canadians, and you've also got a 16-year-old Robbie Robertson, who eventually joins the band. And Robbie Robertson was the guitar player. And Robbie Robertson stands today as pretty much a virtuoso guitar player. And you know, when the final lineup included 1. When you only have 1 guitar player in a band, the Doors, were being Robbie Krieger. And of course any band that Eric Clapton was in. Eddie Van Halen, Kurt Cobain. You have one guitar player, Jimi Hendrix, obviously. They've got to carry all the guitar parts. They've got to be a hell of a guitar player. Pete Townsend. So, and what I mean by that is ordinarily most of the time a band will have two guitar players. One will be the rhythm guitar player, the other will be the lead guitar player. And the rhythm guitar player plays mostly chords, and the lead guitar player will mostly play the solos, the guitar solos. Anyway, so here we have the band, and they're gigging around, and eventually Levon especially didn't like the leadership of the Hawks and certain things, so they decided the 5 guys decided to break away and become their own band. And for a while they're Levon and the Hawks, and they're gigging around, they're playing, and then eventually, and I believe it's 1965, Bob Dylan decides he wants to have a backup band. He's going to start playing electric, like the famous incident at the Newport Folk Festival, whenever he was almost booed off stage and they called him Judas and things like that because he went electric, with Just Like a Woman. Anyway, so Bob Dylan sent somebody out to see this band, and happened to be the guys who happened to be Levon and the Hawks, and they thought they were a great band, so Dylan asked them to join, and they, for better or worse, became Bob Dylan's backup band. So here they're getting, and this was really difficult because according to the guys in the band, with Bob Dylan, you never know when he's going to switch keys or he's going to do something odd or do this or to say. Always have to watch him very, very closely. Watch his mouth, see what he's singing, watch how he's playing his guitar, and they learned a language of looking at each other to be able to tell. The band became an incredibly tight band musically and vocally. I mean, I don't want to get too down on today's music, but you really had to have talent then. I mean, you had to have, and these guys had incredible talent. So we've got about 2 years of the Hawks playing, and at one point, Levon left the band because I think all along he really didn't like Dylan's music. I don't know that he was all that crazy about Dylan as a person. I don't know. I don't think he liked Albert Grossman all that much, who was Bob Dylan's manager, and then became the band's manager. But I know that he didn't like being booed on stage, especially when Dylan was going electric. Like I said, I just don't think he dug the whole scene, for lack of a better term. So he left, and actually they brought in another drummer. Was it Mickey Jones? I'll have to think of the name. I know it was Mickey. And, they kept going for a while. And at some point, I believe in 1967, Dylan eventually invited the members of the band who didn't have a name yet, by the way, up to Woodstock, New York, where he was living. So now the band relocates to Woodstock, New York. And they rent this house. Some of the guys rent this house that's famous to this day, and tourists go by it probably 10 times a day and take pictures. And it was just referred to, it was in Saugerties, New York, and it is in Saugerties, New York, and it's just referred to as the Pink House. And I know that Richard and Rick, and I believe Levon lived there. And eventually the band put out their first album in 1968. It was called Music from Big Pink. Big Pink was, they didn't call it the Pink House, called it Big Pink. So that house was really instrumental in making, especially their first album. But let's back up. So the guys moved with Dylan to Woodstock, New York, and which is a very bohemian town. And the guys record a bunch of tracks with Dylan, and there were some of their own stuff they were beginning to fiddle around with. It was eventually just known as the Basement Tapes. And then they persuaded Levon to come back and rejoin the band. And then the guys did their first album, and as I said, they eventually called it Music from Big Pink. In fact, I think Robbie Robertson's wife, Dominique, wrote the little intro about it, that the music was emanated from Big Pink, from the house, and this, the town of Woodstock, Robbie lived separately with his wife, but the three of the guys at that point lived at Big Pink in the house. Now, the problem was that Woodstock was kind of like Berkeley, kind of like the Greenwich Village. It was a very hip, liberal town, a very bohemian town. And in 1968 and 1969, drugs were really prevalent. And unfortunately for the members of the band, heroin was creeping in rather insidiously. So the guys, they didn't even have a name, but around, Bob Dylan's band, backup band, but around, Woodstock, they were simply known as the band. I mean, Levon, in his sense of humor, was going to call them the Crackers or the Honkies. Why there was such self-deprecating humor, I don't know. Because there was 5 white guys, I really don't know. Levon, it was interesting, even though he's from Arkansas, a really traditionally red state, he was very liberal politically. I don't think his father was, but he was. Maybe it's just being in the music business. Anyway, they eventually settled on just the band, and they put out music from Big Pink, and it was pretty much a sensation. Their first album, it had some Dylan songs and it had some original songs. Like I said, Robbie wrote The Weight, and at this time, for this first album, the guys were still pretty much all there, mentally, physically, cognitively. So Richard helped out with helping Robbie. Robbie Robertson was the primary songwriter, and there's a lot of debate about that too, which I'll cover. But at that time, for that first album, Richard helped Robbie write some of the songs, and Rick helped, and Levon helped. And Garth was always there doing adding all kinds of musical wizardry that I came to talk about. In fact, they called Garth Hudson, he said, the press said he looked like a cross between a mad scientist and a crazed Beethoven up on the keyboards there. So really 2 keyboard players, but Garth also played tuba. They're all multi-instrumentalists. And the amazing thing about the band was, several amazing things about them, but if you lost one of the 5, the band wouldn't work. It would never be the same again. And in fact, when Robbie Robertson did finally leave in 1976, the other guys went on without him over various points, but it was never the same again. They never achieved any real success with their albums, or their touring was quite limited. It was never the same. But even if Garth had left, if Richard had left, these guys, 5 guys, were all so talented and also integral to the sound of the band that any one of them leaving would have been a travesty. And like I said, they're all multi-instrumentalists. The work they did was just unbelievable. You should watch a VH1 show called Behind the Music, and that particular one profiles the band and their amazing second album, which I'll talk about in a minute, which is the one that got me interested in the band. I could listen to that second album forever. Well, that's when they were at their peak, 1969. But anyway, they put out their first album and it had The Weight, which was actually sort of a commercial success. Take a load off, honey. Take a load for free. I'm not going to sing it the way they sang it, although I could. But if you listen to that song and all songs, it's interesting because, like I said, the guys are multi-instrumentalists. They would trade off. On one song, Richard would play piano, Richard would move from the piano to playing drums. Levon would move from drums to playing mandolin. Rick would either stay on bass or play the fiddle. Garth playing tuba, like I said, or keyboards, and Robbie on guitar. Robbie pretty consistently always on guitar and writing songs. Now, Robbie and Garth didn't sing. Robbie tried to sing. He sang one song, the lead for one song on the first record, and basically the story is they convinced Robbie not to sing anymore. He would play guitar and write the songs, and there'd be no band without Robbie Robertson, but he was not a singer. The singers were Levon Helm, Rick, and Richard. All had beautiful voices and all very, very distinct voices. And Levon with that deep southern drawl, and Richard could go way up and be plaintive and hit the those high notes, and Rick was kind of bouncy and all over the place with his voice and with his standing and playing the bass. If you watch I think it's the highest grossing documentary music film of all time, it was simply called The Last Waltz, and it was the last concert that the band ever gave. It was at the Winterland in San Francisco, where it started for them in 1976, Thanksgiving, all Robbie's idea, which I'll tell you about. And watch the guys play, watch the guys sing. Even though Levon really didn't want to be there and really didn't want to be doing it and really didn't want the band to be breaking up. But watch that. Watch The Last Waltz, and you'll see some incredible singing and playing. They also invite all the people they thought were influences and friends over the years with them to play at various times. So Stephen Stills was there, and Eric Clapton, and Canadians Joni Mitchell and Neil Young and Neil Diamond, who Levon famously said, "Why is he here?" And of course Ronnie Hawkins and others, Van Morrison. But anyway, so after the success of the first album, it came very, very quickly, and unfortunately, Richard Manuel was already probably a certified alcoholic by the time he joined the band in his early 20s, by the time he joined the Hawks in his early 20s. And things only got worse from there. But he and Rick and Levon started really getting into substances during that and after that first album, which started to show effects as soon as the second album. They were going to tour, and they couldn't tour right away because Rick was in one of his many car accidents driving drunk, and he was laid up, couldn't move his neck for months. He was laid up and, knew he had let the guys down, but what could they do? So they gained an air of mystery. Where are these guys? Why don't they tour? We've heard this fabulous album, but where are they? Who are they? Back in 1970, they were on the cover of, I believe it was Newsweek magazine or maybe Time. Anyway, so then Robbie starts furiously writing the second album, which was simply called The Band. So it really doesn't have a name. It's also called The Brown Album because the album was brown. So it's called The Brown Album, or simply the band's second album. And it's an incredible piece of music. They were really at their height then, their peak. There's one amazing song called The Night They Drove All Dixie Down. And Robbie says he wanted to write a song. He wanted to write all the songs. It was almost, that second album was almost a concept album. He wanted to write like the story of America all the way through, from east to west. And part of it was the American Civil War and the fascinating things he had learned being a youth and traveling in the South and growing and, traveling while gigging and his trips. And he asked Levon, because Levon's father used to talk about the Civil War. In fact, according to Robbie, Levon's father said, "You mark my words, Robbie, the South will rise again." Anyway, so he asked Levon to take him to the library, and they got some books on the Civil War, and Levon kind of educated him on the Civil War, and they wrote this amazing piece of music told from the Confederates' point of view called The Night They Drove All Dixie Down. And Levon sings the song with harmonies from the other guys. And it's interesting too when you hear the harmonies between, and the singing, the three-part harmony between Levon, Rick, and Richard, who were the singers, kind of like the Grateful Dead, the three guys who sang in the Grateful Dead. But with the guys on the band, basically Robbie said the guys would just hit whatever notes they could hit. They'd reach whatever notes they could reach for the harmonies. So talking about trained vocalists here, you're talking about they would just hit the songs, the harmonies they could hit, and that would be the song. And it really had amazing results, the vocal blend between those three voices. So the problem is that even during this second album, Richard, because of his alcoholism, and at that point Richard was still using drugs as well as alcohol, he really couldn't contribute like he used to. Robbie would try to sit him down at piano and help him write songs, according to Robbie and according to the other guys, and Richard was fading already. And the same with Rick, and even the same with Levon. And they managed, get some co-writing credit, these other guys on that second album, but that was kind of the beginning of the end. And even Levon said that in a great documentary that was made about him and his little traveling band and his daughter, and I think 2004, 2005, some years before he died. By the way, the only two band members that are left are Robbie Robertson and our great honey boy, Garth Hudson. So that second album was really when they were at their peak, up on Cripple Creek, Night They Drove All Dixie Down. I mean, they actually had a couple of commercial hits with the album. It was really universally praised, as it should be. And as a piece of music, the band and that particular album, and the band as a whole, no one could pin down what they were. And George Harrison liked to say this famously. Were they a rock band? Were they a pop band? Were they bluegrass? Were they country? Were they R&B? They had elements of all those things I just mentioned, so you just couldn't pin them down. Robbie deliberately wanted the sound of the second album to be more hollow and wooden and more acoustic, and he didn't play as much guitar on it. In fact, they came out to Los Angeles and they rehearsed somehow they got a hold of Sammy Davis Jr.'s house, and they rehearsed in Sammy Davis Jr.'s pool house. And you can see pictures of it where it was a very small area. They even lived there too. A couple of the guys lived there. I believe Levon and Rick lived there. You could see that it was a very small room, and you could see on stools where Robbie would sit with his guitar, where Garth would be set up with his organ, where Richard's piano was, where Levon's drums were. And it's really very fascinating how they set up in this small space. Anyway, so by the time, and there was another incident, when they were supposed to play, not Woodstock, but when the band was supposed to make, gosh, I don't remember, I don't think it was their first gig, but one of their early gigs, Robbie got off the plane very sick. In fact, he was so sick that the first night, I think it was supposed to be 3 nights. I think it was in San Francisco, but I could be wrong. The first night, what happened was he couldn't get out of bed. And they had a doctor, Albert Grossman, the manager, had not only a doctor, but then had a hypnotist come to the room. And I don't know, I mean, I believe the doctor said it was flu, but the hypnotist was convinced Robbie that it was some kind of incredible stage fright. So the hypnotist put Robbie under hypnosis, and he said, and he was going to stand in the wings of the stage, and he would shout out to Robbie, "Grow, grow." That was the word. He says, whenever I say the word grow, he said this to him under hypnosis, you're going to feel like your back, your legs are made of steel iron springs, and you have strength of 10 men, and you're healthy, and so on and so forth. After the hypnosis, Robbie got out of bed and said he felt better, out of his pajamas for the first time in days. But the first night of the gig, I think he got through 7 songs, and that was it he'd had. And he kept looking off to the wings to the hypnotist, and the hypnotist was there with his grow, grow, and it was really quite a sight to behold, evidently. Second night, I think he got through a few more songs. There were a lot of unhappy. They should have canceled the gig, but they just didn't want to do it. So by the time of the third album, Robbie wrote a song, and he based it on that experience, and it was called Stage Fright, but loosely based on that experience. And he wrote the whole album. He said by that time, and this is 1970 now, after the great success of the second album, Robbie says there was already a great darkness sinking into the band, and it was drugs, it was heroin specifically. And Robbie's complaint all these years to this day, although he even put out a documentary, which I actually saw him live, and then they played the film live here in LA, and he sat down for a sort of a Q&A beforehand and afterward, called Once We're Brothers. Robbie says to this day, his basic attitude is, I desperately wanted the guys to help me write, and they weren't functional anymore. They kind of gave up. The guys, at least Levon says, and maybe Rick, that part of the reason they gave up helping Robbie is because they thought he was hogging all the glory and all the songwriting credits. And this is the major bone. And so what happens is you have Robbie having to write like the next 5 albums basically by himself. So this is the major bone of contention between fans of the band. There's the Robbie camp, in which people think, hey, Robbie was a genius, is a genius. He wanted the guys to help him write, and they were so whacked out on drugs and booze and there are other things that they stopped helping him. And he desperately wanted them to, but they wouldn't. And then there's the other side, and there's a lot of people on this other side. In fact, Levon, like I said, if you watch that documentary of Levon's I was telling you about, made I think in 2004, his main, I think it was his producer and his guitar player, says, basically, he says, Robbie's made a lot of money, implying that the other guys didn't, because the thought was that sort of Albert Grossman, they think, said to Robbie, you're the genius here, you're the functional one, you're the major songwriter, and even if you get ideas, drag ideas out of the other guys, you don't have to get them songwriting credit. Wow, it's a big group of people here. I'm going to let pass for a second. So, look at these people. So, from Stage Fright on, and Stage Fright, Robbie said he wanted to play more guitar on that album. So he's really deciding to formulate these albums based on, to have a certain feel about them. They were never just haphazard. There's more guitar on the third album, Stage Fright album. There's less participation from the other guys. And there's various politics, Grossman was supposed to open a theater up there in Woodstock, and Robbie was telling the guys that they'd all have a piece of the theater and they would record their album there, and I don't know, it never really came to pass. So as far as the money, finance, the quote-unquote politics of the whole situation, I wasn't there, we'll never know the full system, but like I say, there are these two camps. So I think that the band were obligated to produce, I believe, 7 albums. So every couple of years they'd have another album, Cahoots, and an oldies album. And Robbie was finding it increasingly difficult through the years to keep writing these records for the guys to sing and perform. But they did keep singing and performing. They kept touring. So in 1976, early, Robbie, or even before that, Robbie was in a car with Levon, who he still calls his brother, even though Levon had so much animosity at the end towards Robbie, so much. But Robbie says, and Levon said it too, that he said to Levon, I'm really worried. I think we're going to die. Somebody's going to die. I think we're going to die if we keep up in the band. I mean, it's a very unhealthy environment, and I don't want to die. I'm too young. I've got a wife. I've got kids. And Levon famously said, hey, I'm a musician. I ain't in it for my health. Direct quote. So Robbie never forgot this. Eventually in like 75, I think, they moved out to a house in Malibu they called Shangri-La. I've been to that house in front of it. In fact, I should film it for you. And somewhere they carved their names in the concrete, but I wasn't able to find that. They were recording in Malibu, helping out Bob Dylan on his Planet Waves album. And the band's albums were not doing well commercially. So in 1976, Robbie decided to call, after their record contract was done, they fulfilled all their albums, Robbie decided to call it quits. And he said he wanted to have one blowout performance. And evidently Robbie implied that they would get back together in the future, although Robbie never came back to the band ever again. That was their last performance. Never recorded with them again, never played with them. But he said that this would be their last blowout concert. They call it the Last Waltz. Do it in San Francisco, do it on Thanksgiving, have a full meal served, have dancing, like ballroom dancing, which they did. He got Martin Scorsese, who became his lifelong friend, to direct it. In fact, Martin Scorsese and Robbie Robertson became roommates for a while after Robbie's separation from Dominique. And to this day, of the day of this filming, Robbie still contributes music soundtracks. That's his primary thing, does Martin Scorsese soundtracks, which will make him a hell of a lot of money. Smart move, smart businessman. Like I said, Robbie and Garth were the only two that never got into the substances nearly to the degree that the other 3 guys did. So they did the Last Waltz, that concert, in 1976 at Thanksgiving, and they didn't know what direction they were going to go from there. But Robbie never rejoined them again, and the guys kept playing in various forms through the years. Unfortunately, Richard continued to go some really bad times, And I believe it was 1985, at a period where he had gotten sober and then started drinking again. Poor Richard actually hung himself in the shower of a hotel when the band was gigging, and God, talk about trauma. Rick and then Levon found him dead there, hanging in the shower, and it was terrible, terrible suicide. About 10, 12 years later, Rick died. Young guy, he had gained quite a bit of weight since his lean, mean days in the 60s and 70s. And his heart just gave out. Years of substance abuse took its toll. And he was, Levon really felt bad, never forgot them, because even in this documentary of Levon's, it might even be called Ain't It For My Health, filmed in 2004, I believe, he was very embittered by what had happened with the band, and they were talking about how he had absolutely no desire to go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame or be a Lifetime Achievement Award or any type of awards that he could win. And he says on camera, what about Rick and Richard? What did they do for them? What did they have? So his loyalty, of course. So his loyalty to these guys was very great. It was very heartfelt. But Levon had cancer and was actually going to his cancer treatments, which is on camera during the documentary. And he did pass away some years later. So now we're left with just Robbie and Robbie's documentary, Once Were Brothers, and Garth. Actually, at the time of this filming, Garth's longtime wife, Maud Hudson, just died. Very sad, very, very sad, with Garth for a very long time. So that's the story of the band. And as much as I love the music, as you can tell, I've studied the group, and there's just so much darkness surrounding them. And what's the darkness, folks? It's drugs, and heroin in particular, and deep alcoholism, and a lot of sadness. It's said that Levon might have been an undiagnosed bipolar. Maybe he was diagnosed, maybe not, who knows. But they were a great band, 5 extraordinarily talented, creative guys that had kept it going for a long, long time. I mean, Robbie quit in his 16th year with the band. So gosh, I guess he was only 32 at the time. But they had been together for, a lifetime. Anyway, that's my story of the group, The Band, and what happened to them. And check out the first and second album in particular, Music from Big Pink, and the Brown album, or the second album, simply titled The Band. That'll give you an idea when these guys were at their peak, the genius. Okay, guys, in fact, there's a famous story of they were playing the first album live for Bob Dylan, and they played The Wait. And Dylan said, "Who wrote that song?" And Robbie said, "I did." He said, "You wrote that song, Robbie? I can't believe it, man. It's a great song." And I could just picture Dylan grinning from ear to ear. And it was a great song. It was a great album. Okay, guys, Ron here. Pleasure being with you again. If you like the content, please subscribe if you haven't already. Please give the channel likes, and I almost always appreciate your comments, 98% of the time, I'd say. All right, guys, we'll see you at the next location. Ron out. Bye.